Ethan Whitford was only 10 years old, but his small world had already become quiet, heavy, and still. He lived inside a giant mansion with bright walls, shiny floors, and long hallways that echoed with silence. His father, Charles Whitford, was one of the richest men in the city, but no amount of money could fix the pain inside their home. Because Ethan had not walked since the day his mother died. Not one step, not even one try. Doctors came, therapists came, specialists came, but Ethan never responded. He did not speak, he did not smile, he did not reach out for anything. He sat in his wheelchair with empty eyes, staring somewhere far away from everyone. The staff tried to help, but they always left after a few weeks. Saying the same thing every time: the boy doesn't want to move. Charles felt helpless. He could buy airplanes, buildings, and companies, but he could not buy a cure for grief every morning. He walked into Ethan's room, hoping for even a small change. But Ethan only looked at the window, never at him. Charles whispered, "I'm here, son." Yet Ethan gave no reply. The mansion became a place of sadness. Lights were bright, but hearts were dim. Even the workers moved like shadows, trying not to upset the silent boy. Some believed Ethan was physically unable to walk, but the truth was deeper. His body worked, but his spirit had stopped. Stopped the day he lost the only person who made him feel safe. One evening, Charles sat in his office. His head in his hands, he felt guilt heavy on his shoulders. Thinking he failed his son, the old housekeeper, Mrs. Olson, stepped in and said softly, "Sir, maybe you need someone different. Someone with a new kind of patience." Charles lifted his eyes. "Exhausted, different how?" he asked. She answered, "Someone who isn't afraid to face pain." The next morning, a new worker arrived. Her name was Grace. A black woman with calm eyes, steady hands, and a soft voice that carried quiet strength. She wore a simple uniform, carried no fancy bags, and did not seem intimidated by the size of the mansion. The staff whispered, wondering how long she would last. Nobody lasted long with Ethan. Charles met her in the hallway. "You've read the file," he said. Grace nodded. "Yes." "Sir, he doesn't talk," Charles warned. "He doesn't look at anyone. And he never tries to move." Grace simply replied, "I understand," as if she had heard similar stories before. When Grace entered Ethan's room for the first time, she didn't tiptoe. She didn't whisper like others. She didn't act scared or overly gentle. Instead, she stood near him and said with a warm smile, "Good morning, Ethan." Her voice was steady, not forced. Ethan didn't look at her. But something changed in the air, a soft shift. Like a window opening in a closed room, Grace began cleaning the room while talking to him as if he were any normal child. She told him stories about her morning bus ride. She joked about how her shoes were already tired. She hummed a gentle song while folding blankets. Most people acted like Ethan was fragile, but Grace acted like he was present, alive, listening, and that made a difference. Even if small. At lunch, she returned with a plate and placed it near him. "You don't have to eat right now," she said, "but I'll leave it here, just in case you change your mind." Nobody had ever spoken to him like that before. Ethan's eyes moved, slowly, quietly, toward the plate. It was the first sign of response in months. Charles passed by the doorway and saw the scene. His heart jumped, but he stayed silent, afraid his presence would ruin the fragile moment. Grace noticed Ethan's small movement, but did not celebrate or make it dramatic. She simply smiled and said, "There you go, see? Small things matter." That afternoon, while she dusted the bookshelf, something unbelievable happened. Ethan blinked slowly once. Toussaint then shifted his fingers. Grace turned toward him gently, not rushing. "You're trying," she whispered. "I can see it." Ethan lowered his gaze. But the movement had happened. It was real. The boy who hadn't moved in months had responded to a voice that did not pity him, a presence that did not fear his silence, a woman who saw him not as broken, but as a child who needed courage, and without knowing it, Ethan took his first invisible step not with his legs, but with his heart. A step that would lead him toward something no one in the mansion believed possible. Because Grace had just arrived, and she was about to change everything. Grace woke before sunrise the next morning. She stood in the quiet kitchen, warming her hands around a cup of tea. The mansion was still half asleep, lights dim, halls empty, and the air heavy with the same sadness she felt the day before. But Grace was not the kind of woman who let silence scare her. She had seen darker places in life and had learned to walk through them with calm steps. She remembered Ethan's tiny movement from yesterday. That small shift of his fingers had told her something important. The boy was not unwilling, he was afraid. Trapped inside memories he could not escape, Grace whispered to herself. Fear is louder than pain, but she also knew that even fear could be challenged. Slowly, gently, and with love, by the time she reached Ethan's room. Morning light had already filled the space. Ethan sat in his wheelchair like always, eyes fixed on nothing, posture stiff, body silent. But Grace noticed the small things others ignored. His breath was slightly faster today, his shoulders were less tense, and his hands were not curled tightly like before. Something inside him was listening. Even if he did not show it, Grace tapped the door softly. Not asking for permission, but showing respect. Good morning. Ethan, she said with a voice warm like sunlight. She opened the curtains wider. Letting soft golden light touch his skin, Ethan didn't react. But his eyes flickered, the tiniest motion. Grace smiled to herself and began the day's tasks, humming a slow, peaceful tune. She cleaned while talking to him the same way she would speak to any boy. Today is Wednesday, she said, folding his clothes. I hope you like this weather. She made no demands, no pressure. No questions he couldn't answer instead. She let him feel her presence like a steady heartbeat in the room. Most people came to Ethan with instructions. But Grace came with patience when she placed his breakfast near him. She didn't push it toward his hands. You can eat when you want, she said. Your choice matters. That simple statement made Ethan blink. Choice nobody had offered him that in a long time. A child who lost control of his world noticed every small sign of respect, and Grace gave him that without hesitation. Around mid-morning, Charles walked past the open doorway. He saw Grace placing a small radio on the table. She turned the volume low, letting soft music fill the room. Charles frowned slightly, unsure, but Grace nodded politely and said, Music heals places words can't reach. Charles didn't argue. He only hoped her confidence might someday match Ethan's progress. Grace sat near Ethan, not too close, not too far. She began telling him a story about her childhood. How I used to race my brothers, she said with a playful laugh. And I would always lose. Her laughter filled the room like a warm blanket. For a moment, Ethan's eyes lifted toward her voice. It was not a full look, but it was more than yesterday. Grace noticed, but she stayed calm. She knew sudden excitement could shut him down, so she continued speaking softly, letting her voice flow like water over stones. Losing wasn't bad, she said, because I learned to get up every time when she said those words. Ethan's fingers twitched again. A memory stirred inside him, one he had buried too deep for anyone to reach. Grace rose from her chair and walked to the window. She pointed outside. The garden looks nice today, she said. I think you'd like it. Then she added something new, something bold. And I think you can see it from closer one day. Ethan's head moved so small. So slow, but it moved. A tiny tilt, a response, a sign that her words were reaching him. During lunch, something unexpected happened. Grace placed a new dish near him and asked softly, Can I show you something? She did not wait for permission, but she moved gently, giving him time to refuse. She held up a napkin and folded it into a small shape of bird with open wings. It's not perfect, she said with a smile, but it reminds me of trying. Ethan stared at the little bird, his breathing uneven. Grace saw emotion forming in his eyes like a cloud about to release rain. She whispered, Your mother would want you to try too. Ethan froze. His eyes tightened, his chest trembled. And for the first time, he made a sound, not a word, but a soft, broken breath. Grace did not touch him, did not crowd him. She simply whispered, It's okay to feel. When Charles returned later, he found Ethan slightly leaning forward in his chair. Not much, but enough to know something had changed. Grace stood quietly beside him, her posture steady like someone guarding a fragile flame. Charles felt hope in his chest, hope he had not felt in months. A hope born from a stranger who spoke to his son's soul without needing to raise her voice. As the day ended, Ethan lifted the folded paper bird with trembling fingers. It was the first thing he had held since his mother died. Grace watched with soft eyes, whispering gently, "You're stronger than you know." And though Ethan said nothing, his silence felt different now, not empty silence, but silence carrying the first signs of life stirring again inside him. Part 3 will bring an even bigger breakthrough. Just tell me and I'll continue. The next morning arrived with soft rain tapping against the mansion windows. The sky was gray, the air cool, and everything felt slow and quiet. But inside Ethan's room, something had already changed. A small paper bird sat on his bedside table, its wings slightly bent, its shape imperfect but meaningful. Grace saw it the moment she stepped in, and she felt a warm hope rise inside her chest. "Good morning, Ethan," she said with her usual calm smile. He didn't look at her, but his eyes were not empty today. They were focused on something unseen. Something inside himself. Grace knew this look. She had seen it before in children who carried grief heavier than their bodies could hold. It meant he was thinking, remembering, fighting a quiet battle no one else could see. She began cleaning, as always, humming softly, letting her voice fill the room without disturbing him. As she folded blankets, she spoke gently, "Ethan, I've met children who were afraid of everything." She kept her voice steady. "Afraid to run? Afraid to try? Afraid to breathe too deeply?" Ethan blinked slowly. He was listening, even if he pretended not to. "But do you know what made them strong?" she said, placing books neatly on his shelf. They stopped believing they were weak. Those words were different, stronger, sharp enough to reach deeper. Grace was not giving him comfort today. She was challenging him. And Ethan felt that difference like a small push against the wall he had built around himself. Grace walked closer and sat on the small chair beside him. She didn't invade his space. "But she didn't keep distance the way others did, Ethan," she said softly. "I will tell you something you won't like." His breath caught. No one had spoken to him like that in years. People tiptoed around him as if he would break with a single word. "But not Grace. You are not made of glass," she said, her voice firm. "You are not a broken thing." Ethan's fingers tightened around the armrest of his wheelchair. Not in anger, but in fear. Fear of facing what he had buried for so long. Grace noticed every tiny reaction, every shift in his shoulders, every flicker of emotion in his eyes. "Your legs are not the problem," she continued. "Your pain is." The words struck him like a sudden gust of wind. He looked at hurriedly, looked at hurriedly second. It was quick, fragile, but full of emotion he couldn't hide. Grace held his gaze gently, not letting him feel shame for the tears forming in his eyes. "You miss your mother," she whispered. Ethan's whole body shivered. The truth was too sharp, too real. His throat tightened as broken memories rose like waves. He remembered her voice, her laugh, her warm hands holding his. And he remembered the day everything went silent. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to push the memories away. But Grace continued softly. "You loved her so much that when she left, you stopped living too." A tear slipped down his cheek. It was small, but it carried months of trapped grief. Grace let him cry without touching him, letting the moment belong to him alone. After a long silence, she said, "Ethan, your mother wouldn't want this for you." Her voice trembled slightly with emotion she tried to hide. "She would want you to stand, to walk, to try." Ethan shook his head weakly, fear overwhelming him. He had not tried to stand since the day his world collapsed. Even thinking about it made his legs feel heavy and cold. Then Grace did something no one expected. She rose from her chair, walked to a small drawer, and brought out a wooden bird, beautiful hand-carved wings spread in flight. She placed it beside the paper bird he had held yesterday. "This one," she said softly, "I made long ago." Ethan stared at it. His breath uneven, he recognized the style. The shape his mother had carved something similar for him once. Grace saw the realization in his eyes. She whispered, "Some things break us so we can learn to rise again." her words wrapped around him like a gentle hand lifting his chin. Ethan reached out, trembling. His fingers touched the wooden bird. Grace did not help him, she let him do it alone. Because she refused to pity him, pity would only keep him chained to his sadness. For the first time, Ethan's hand lifted on its own. The movement was shaky, small, but real. Grace smiled softly, her eyes shining. "You see?" she said. "You can do more than you think." Ethan stared at the wooden bird. Tears falling silently, but they were not tears of despair today. They were tears of awakening in that quiet room. Something powerful had begun. Ethan was not healed, not yet. But he had taken another invisible step, a step toward courage, a step toward life. And Grace knew the next part of his journey would test him even more. The rain had stopped by the next morning, leaving the world washed clean and soft. Sunlight slipped through the thin curtains of Ethan's room. Landing gently on his face, he did not move. But there was something different in the way he breathed. He no longer looked like a statue frozen in time. He looked like a boy waiting for something he didn't understand. Grace stepped inside quietly, holding a small tray of breakfast. But today, she wasn't watching the food or the room. Today, she was watching Ethan. His eyes were not empty. They were wandering toward the wooden bird she had placed yesterday, as if the little carving was calling to something deep inside his heart. "Good morning, Ethan," Grace said softly. Her voice floated through the room with gentle warmth. Ethan didn't speak, but his eyelashes trembled. Grace noticed because she noticed everything. She placed the tray on the table and walked toward the window. She pushed the curtains wider, letting golden light spill across the floor. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Grace turned and walked toward his bedside. She picked up the wooden bird with slow, careful hands. "This piece means something to you?" she whispered. Ethan's eyes widened just a little. Enough for Grace to see she had touched a hidden place in his memory. She placed the bird gently in his lap. Ethan stared at it, his fingers trembling. The carved wings, the rough lines, the shape, everything reminded him of her. Of the one memory he tried to forget so he wouldn't break. His mother used to carve wooden animals for him when he was scared. She told him each one carried a piece of courage inside it. "Did your mother make something like this for you?" Grace asked gently. Ethan's lips parted slightly. A tiny sound escaped him, not a word, but a breath of emotion. His chest rose unevenly as a flood of memories pushed through the walls he had built. He remembered sitting on the grass while his mother carved a wooden bird just like this one. He remembered her smile, warm like sunlight. And he remembered the last day he saw her. The day she told him, "You are stronger than you think." Ethan, those words, once his shield, had become a wound he carried alone. Grace watched his face closely. She saw the pain, but she also saw the love hidden beneath it. "Your mother was brave," she whispered. Ethan felt something crack open inside his chest. Tears welled in his eyes again, but he didn't wipe them. He let them fall, slow and warm. The room felt heavier and lighter at the same time. As if grief and healing were sitting together, Grace sat beside him quietly. Giving him space, after a moment, she spoke again. "Ethan, memories don't come to hurt us," she said softly. "They come to remind us what we are capable of." Ethan looked at her with trembling eyes. Grace didn't look away. She met his gaze with steady strength. "You stopped walking because you were hurting," she continued. "But your mother wouldn't want you to stay frozen." Ethan shook his head weakly. His voice still locked inside him, but Grace leaned forward and whispered, "Your mother's courage did not die with her." Those words hit him like a soft hammer, breaking the last piece of the wall around his heart. He reached out, slower than a falling leaf, and touched Grace's hand. His fingers curled around hers, fragile but deliberate. Grace felt a lump in her throat. This was not a simple gesture. It was a cry for help, a plea for guidance, a spark of trust. "You're doing so well," she whispered. "You're trying." Ethan blinked. Tears dripping onto the wooden bird in his lap, he pressed it against his chest. Holding it like a piece of his mother returned to him. For the first time, he did not shake with fear. He shook with something new, something close to strength. Just then, Charles stood in the doorway, unseen by Ethan. He watched his son holding the bird, crying softly. Charles pressed a hand to his mouth. Overwhelmed, he wanted to run to him. But Grace lifted her eyes and gave him a tiny shake of her head. She knew Ethan needed this moment without interruption. Charles stepped back silently, tears in his own eyes. He finally understood something he had missed for months. His son didn't need more doctors, more money, more machines. He needed someone who spoke to his soul, someone who saw him. Not his illness, someone like Grace, as the morning light grew brighter. Ethan lifted his head, his eyes red, his cheeks wet. But there was a spark inside them, a spark Grace had been waiting for. She squeezed his hand gently and said, "This is where healing begins." And Ethan, still silent, still fragile, tightened his grip as if saying, "I'm ready." The next day arrived with a soft wind brushing through the mansion's garden. Birds chirped outside Ethan's window. Their songs gentle and hopeful, Grace entered his room early, carrying not just breakfast, but a quiet determination in her eyes. Today, she had to plan something new, something bold, because she knew Ethan was ready for a challenge. Even if he didn't know it yet, Ethan sat in his wheelchair as usual, hands resting on the wooden bird he held like a treasure. He looked calmer today, not healed, not confident, but calm in a way a frightened child becomes when he finally feels safe. Grace noticed the steadiness in his breathing, the way his eyes followed her movements more than before, small changes, but powerful ones. "Good morning, Ethan," she said, her voice soft but bright. He blinked once, a tiny greeting. Grace smiled proudly. Most people would have missed the gesture, but Grace treated every small response like the beginning of a miracle. She placed the wooden bird on the table and knelt in front of him. "Ethan," she said gently, "I want to try something different today." At her words, Ethan's shoulders tensed, his eyes dropped to his hands. Fear creeping back into his chest, Grace reached out and placed her hand over his gently. "Don't worry," she whispered. "We will only try what you feel ready for." She moved slowly, giving him time to breathe. "I want to help you stretch your legs a little," she said. "That's all." Ethan's lips parted, a shaky breath escaping him. His mind raced with memories, hospital beds, therapists pushing him, voices telling him to try harder. Those moments had left him terrified of being forced again, but Grace wasn't like them. She waited, patient, unhurried. Her presence was steady, like a warm hand guiding him through darkness. After a long moment, Ethan gave a small nod. Barely visible, but real. Grace smiled softly. "Thank you." She placed her hands on his calves gently. Her touch was warm, reassuring. "Tell me if anything hurts," she murmured. Then she began slowly moving his legs, just a stretch. Nothing more. Ethan stiffened at first. The sensation felt strange after months of stillness. But Grace spoke calmly as she worked. "Your legs remember how to move," she said. "They just need a little encouragement for the first time." Ethan felt something he had forgotten, a tiny spark of awareness in his muscles. A whisper of life returning. It frightened him, but it also awakened something hopeful. Grace continued speaking softly. "You're not alone," she said. "I'm right here." And those words became an anchor for Ethan. He let himself relax. Just a little. Enough for Grace to stretch his legs more freely. Enough for healing to take its first real breath after a few minutes. Grace stood and walked behind him. "Ethan, I'm going to move your chair closer to the bed," she said. He looked up at her with wide eyes, fear flickering again. But she kept smiling, warm and confident. "It's okay," she whispered. "I won't let anything happen to you." She turned the wheelchair slowly. Then she placed her hands around his shoulders. "Can you lean forward for me?" she asked. Just a little. Ethan hesitated. His whole body trembled. Fear, memory, grief all swirling inside him, but something pushed him forward. Not strength, not courage, but trust. Trust in the woman who never lied to him, never pitied him, never forced him. He leaned forward, just an inch. Grace's heart filled with pride. "Good," she whispered. "Now try to move your right foot." Ethan froze. His breath came fast, uneven. The idea of moving his own foot terrified him more than anything else. But Grace waited patiently. She gave him time to fight the fear inside him. He squeezed his eyes shut, tears gathered in the corners. His fingers gripped the sides of the wheelchair tightly. Then, with all the strength of a child breaking free from fear, his foot moved. Just a tiny slide across the floor, but it moved. Grace gasped softly. Her eyes filling with emotion, she didn't show. She didn't clap or shout or make a scene. She simply whispered, "Ethan, you did it." Ethan opened his eyes slowly. He looked down, saw his foot slightly shifted, and a sound escaped him, half cry, half breath, full of disbelief. Grace kneeled in front of him and held his shaking hands. "You are stronger than your fear," she whispered. Ethan stared at her, tears falling silently, but this time, they weren't tears of pain. They were tears of discovery. Discovery of something he thought he had lost forever. His own ability to try, to move, to hope. The boy who once refused to move had just taken his first step toward a miracle. Not with his legs, but with his courage. And Grace knew the next challenge she planned would change everything. The house felt different that morning, not louder, not busier, but charged with a quiet electricity, as if the walls themselves were waiting for something to happen. Grace felt it the moment she stepped inside the mansion. She walked down the long hallway with steady steps, carrying a calm determination in her heart, because today, she planned to take Ethan farther than ever before, not to push him, not to pressure him, but to show him that his courage was stronger than the fear that had locked him still for months. When she entered Ethan's room, she saw him holding the wooden bird again. His fingers curled around it tightly, his eyes focused on it as if drawing strength from its carved wings. Grace smiled warmly. "Good morning." "Ethan?" she said softly. He blinked once. A quiet greeting he now used only for her. Grace knelt in front of him, her voice low and gentle. "Ethan, I want to try one more thing today." His breathing changed, immediately shaky. Uncertain, he remembered the stretch from yesterday. The tiny movement of his foot. He remembered the fear, but also the surprising relief when he realized he had done it. Grace saw the emotion passing across his face like a shadow. "It's nothing scary," she said. "We will go very slowly." She placed her hand on his once, giving him time to feel safe. Then she said the words he never expected to hear. "I want you to try standing." Ethan's whole body stiffened. His eyes widened in fear. A trembling breath escaped his lips. Standing was not just hard. Standing was the mountain he had been too afraid to climb. Standing reminded him of the last time he tried, the day his mother died. The day he collapsed into grief so deep, he refused to move again. Grace saw the panic rise in him. She reached up and gently touched his cheek. "Ethan, listen," she whispered. "You are not alone this time." Those words settled into his heart like a warm blanket. Slowly, painfully, the panic softened. He looked at her with eyes full of fear and trust all mixed together. Grace carefully locked the wheels of his chair. Then she placed both hands on his shoulders. "I'm right here," she said. "I won't let you fall." Ethan's breath trembled as he lowered his chin. His knees quivered even before trying. But he didn't look away from her, not once, because Grace had become the anchor he had needed for so long. "On 3, she whispered. 1, his fingers tightened on the armrests. 2, his tears filled his eyes. 3, Ethan pushed, slowly, painfully, like lifting a mountain with his tiny legs. His arms shook violently, his face twisted with fear. His breath came fast and broken. Grace pressed her hands against his sides, steadying him without lifting him. "You're doing it," she whispered. "Keep going." "I'm here." And then, for the first time in almost a year, Ethan's legs straightened under him. He rose, inch by trembling inch, until he was standing on his own legs, standing like a child who had carried mountains in his heart. Grace's eyes filled with tears she tried to hide. Ethan swayed, terrified, but she held his hands gently, guiding his balance. "You're standing." "Ethan," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You're really standing at the doorway." Unseen by the two of them, Charles froze. His briefcase slipped from his hand and hit the floor with a soft thud. His eyes filled instantly with tears that blurred the world. He pressed a hand to his mouth, unable to breathe. He watched his son, his fragile, Silent sun standing beside Grace like a miracle in motion. Ethan's legs trembled harder. He leaned forward, gripping Grace's hands. Fear swept through him again, but Grace lowered her forehead close to his and whispered, "Look at me." He looked, shaking, crying, but looking. "Take one breath," she said. He did. Now another. He did again, slower this time. Then she said the words that set the world into motion. "Let's try one step." Ethan gasped softly. His legs threatened to buckle, his chest rose and fell like a storm. But Grace stayed with him, steady and unshaken. "You can do it," she whispered. "Just one." And then Ethan moved his right foot forward. Just an inch, just enough, just a miracle. A broken sob escaped Grace's throat. Charles collapsed to his knees in the hallway. And Ethan stood there crying, not from fear, not from pain, but from disbelief. He had done the impossible. The boy who once refused to move had taken a step toward life again, a step that changed everything. A step that proved he was stronger than the silence that had trapped him for so long. And this was only the beginning. The mansion was quieter that evening. Not with the heavy silence of grief, but with the soft stillness that follows a miracle. Ethan had truly stood for the first time since his mother's death, and the memory of that moment lingered in every corner of the house like a warm light refusing to fade. Grace sat beside Ethan now, his small hand held gently in hers. He looked exhausted, cheeks streaked with dried tears, but there was something new in his eyes, something bright, something alive, a spark that had slept inside him for too long. And now it glowed like a flame learning to breathe. Charles paced back and forth outside the room, his heart still pounding from the shock of what he had seen. He had never felt so powerless and so grateful at the same time. He wanted to rush inside, hug his son, fall to his knees, but he was afraid that interrupting the fragile moment might break something precious. When Grace finally stepped out of the room, she found him standing there frozen, his eyes red, his shoulders shaking. "Is he all right?" Charles whispered. Grace nodded softly, her voice warm. "He's stronger than he knows," she said. He just needed someone to remind him. Charles swallowed, emotion rising so fast he couldn't breathe. "How did you do it?" he asked. Voice cracking, Grace looked down at her hands. Her calm expression carried a grief she usually kept hidden. "I didn't," she said quietly. "Ethan did," but Charles shook his head. "You reached him," he insisted. "You did something no therapist, no specialist, no doctor could do." Grace met his eyes gently, knowing he deserved the truth. "I once had a son," she said softly. The hallway fell still. Charles's breath caught in his throat. Grace continued, her voice trembling with pain she never spoke about. "He was born very sick," she whispered. "He couldn't walk, he couldn't speak. And the doctors said he would never grow strong." Charles listened, eyes softening with understanding. "Hey." Grace's voice grew heavier as she continued. "I cared for him every day," she said, held him, encouraged him, sang to him. Her lips trembled. "He didn't live long," she whispered, tears gathering in her eyes. "But he taught me how to love without fear." A tear slid down Charles's cheek. Whispered, "I'm so sorry." Grace nodded, wiping her eyes gently. "It's all right." She said, "I carry his strength with me." Then she looked back at Ethan's door. "And I saw that same strength in your son." Charles felt a wave of guilt wash over him. "I should have helped him," he said brokenly. "I should have been there." Grace touched his arm gently. "You were grieving too," she said softly. "Pain makes even strong men forget how to breathe." Inside the room, Ethan lay propped against pillows, his legs still trembling from the effort, but he cradled the wooden bird to his chest with both hands, as if the carving carried everything he had been missing: love, memory, courage, and the feeling that he was not alone. Grace walked back inside and knelt beside him. "You did so well today," she whispered. Ethan looked at her with wide, emotional eyes. He reached out slowly, with effort, and placed his small hand on hers, a gesture of trust. A silent thank you. Then something extraordinary happened, something no one expected. Ethan whispered, in a voice soft as wind. "Don't go." Grace froze. Her heart swelling with emotion, she squeezed his hand gently. "I'm not going anywhere," she whispered back. Ethan's eyes filled with tears, but unlike before, these tears brought warmth instead of fear. Charles stepped inside finally, unable to stay away any longer. He knelt beside his son's bed, his voice shaking. "Ethan," he whispered. "I'm here." Ethan lifted his head. For the first time in months, he looked at his father without fear. Grace stepped back silently, letting father and son share the moment. Ethan reached out, his arms weak, trembling, but reaching. Charles broke down completely as he leaned forward and hugged him, holding him in a way he had been too afraid to hope for. Ethan whispered one more word, "Daddy." The room filled with quiet sobs. Not of pain, not of grief, but of healing. Of a family finding each other again after being lost for too long. Later that evening, as stars appeared outside the window, Charles turned to Grace with deep sincerity. "I want you to stay," he said. "Not as a maid, not as staff, but as someone who saved my son." Grace's eyes softened. She nodded slowly, and in that moment, the house finally felt whole again. Because Ethan had walked toward hope, and Grace had walked into a family she didn't know she needed. And together, they erased the silence that once filled the mansion. A miracle had happened inside those walls, a miracle born of courage, kindness, and one woman who refused to give up.